So I'd like to start by sharing an experience that I had. I was about 14 or 15 years old. It was summer vacation, and my dad had planned a trip for us to Germany. And we were going to be there for about a month, maybe 5 weeks, more or less. He was going to be spending some time doing research at a university, and I was going to be taking a German language course for the summer. So it was a really fun opportunity for me because I was going to not only learn German, but these summer language programs usually have a lot of fun trips, and you have the opportunity of meeting people from all over the world. So I was excited for that. And the people that I hung out with the most, I made 2 good friends there. One was a girl from Finland, and another was a guy from Uzbekistan, which, to be honest, I didn't even know he existed before this trip. So it was fun getting to know a little bit more about Uzbekistan, where it is on the map, and all of that. We all spoke a little bit of English, but since we were there to learn German, we really made an effort to try to communicate using as much German as we could. Obviously, we had a lot of sign language in the middle as well to try to talk to each other. So that was fun, from 3 different continents, all different languages, and trying to come together and learn the same language. So one of the trips that we took during an afternoon after class was to the zoo at the city. And the 3 of us, we hung out together all afternoon. We kind of strayed away from the rest of the group. It was just us. And I remember it was kind of a cloudy, a little bit chilly day. And what made the trip so fun was that we would go from one animal to the next, trying to read the labels, trying to understand what they were saying in German, trying to figure out what the name of the animals were in German, kind of based on, okay, this is obviously a lion, so maybe this means lion. And so that's what we were doing all afternoon. Obviously, we didn't have Google Translate or anything. This was about 10 years ago or something, so we didn't carry smartphones everywhere. So a lot of it was guesswork and just trying to figure out based on the little bit that we knew and all of that. So I don't remember a lot of the animals, to be honest. The one thing that I do remember about the trip that stood out to me a lot was that we learned what the word stur meant. That's the one detail that I remember for sure about this afternoon, this trip. We were by a donkey or a mule pen or something like that, and the label described donkeys as being stur. And none of us had heard that word before. We had no idea what it meant, but so it took a while for us to figure out what the meaning was. As it turns out, stur means stubborn. So obviously donkeys are known for being stubborn, so we were able to make that association. And again, I don't know why, but that one thing really stuck with me. It was memorable for some reason. I think it was funny. We had a fun time figuring out what it meant, and so I remember that to this day. That is where I learned what the word stur in German means. So donkeys are known for being stubborn, and even if you don't know a lot about them, that's probably the one thing you do know: donkeys are stubborn. And especially since stubborn as a mule is a well-known idiom. Mules are offspring of donkeys and horses, but the stubbornness that they have definitely comes from the donkey side of the family. So I bring this up because the text that we're going to be looking at today has an ancient Greek variation of the idiom stubborn as a mule. So let's go to Acts chapter 26. And thank you, Ziva, for reading so nicely. Acts chapter 26, verses 14 through 18. And I'll just read it again together first to get into the passage. So, verse 14. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads." And I said, "Who are you, Lord?" And the Lord said, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But rise and stand upon your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and witness to the things in which you have seen me and to those in which I will appear to you, delivering you from your people and from the Gentiles to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me." So let me first give some context of what is going on here in Acts chapter 26. This is at the end of Paul's third missionary journey. And when he returned from his trip, he went to Jerusalem, and there he was arrested in the temple. He had been seen in town with some Gentile friends, and when he went to the temple, some of the Jews there thought mistakenly that he had maybe brought those Gentile friends with him to the temple, which was illegal, forbidden. So he was arrested, and obviously it wasn't only for this reason, this was just the trigger. A lot of the Jews didn't like Paul, they had issues with him, and just the fact that maybe he might have brought Gentiles to the temple was a big moment that really angered the entire mob that was there at the temple. So he was arrested, but he was taken into custody by the Romans. And it soon became clear that Paul would not receive a fair trial under Jewish law. And there was even a plot to take his life because the Jews were so angry at him. So when this was uncovered, they decided to transfer Paul to the city of Caesarea, where he would be watched more closely under Roman supervision. And the Roman procurator, Felix, lived in Caesarea. That was his main station, basically. Felix, however, he was a very corrupt politician. He was more interested in his own personal gain than in ruling fairly in Paul's case. So he decided to keep Paul in, trying to establish good connections with the Jewish leaders. And though Paul had the chance of defending himself and presenting his case before Festus, he still feared that he wouldn't get a fair trial through Festus. So then he appeals to Caesar. Paul was a Roman citizen, and every Roman citizen had the right to appeal to Caesar if they felt that they were being treated unfairly or judged unfairly. So not necessarily straight to Caesar, but to the higher instance, and including to Caesar himself if they felt the need. And that's what Paul does. And it is after Paul appeals to Caesar that King Agrippa II and his sister Bernice come to pay Festus a visit. Now remember, Festus is new. He had just come into this new position. So he was still establishing connections with the rulers and the leaders of Judea. So it's probably in order to congratulate Festus on the new job that Agrippa came to visit him. And we know from history that it seems like Agrippa and Festus ended up developing a very good working relationship with each other after this initial visit. Agrippa was from the family of Herod the Great, Herod who had ordered the killing of all of the babies when Jesus was a baby. So that Herod, King Agrippa II, was his grandson. So being from the family of Herod, he was a half-Jew. And he was well aware of how Judaism worked, how to deal with the Jews, and even what was in the Jewish scriptures. So Festus was very grateful to get Agrippa's perspective on what report to send to Caesar regarding Paul's case. Festus didn't know very well, he didn't understand exactly what was going on. So Agrippa agrees to listen to Paul's defense. In Acts chapter 6, we find the speech that Paul does in front of Agrippa. He uses the opportunity not only to defend himself, but to share the gospel with Agrippa and Bernice. And he shares the gospel by telling them his story. So here in Acts chapter 26, we find the third account in the book of Acts of Paul's conversion story. So there's three different situations in which the story is told. But this account here in chapter 26 has a few details that aren't mentioned anywhere else, including verse 14 that we just read, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. So, as I mentioned before, to kick against the goads is an ancient Greek variation of the idiom to be stubborn like a mule. This saying or proverb comes from the rural setting in which farmers used oxen to help, work their fields and things like that. Goads, they were pieces of wood with a sharp end on one side that they would use to prod the oxen along when they got too stubborn, didn't want to go in the right direction, or didn't want to do their job. So usually the oxen that they would protest and kick against the goad that was prodding them along, and kicking against it was obviously painful because it was sharp, it hurt. So the more they kicked and resisted, the more it hurt. In other words, to kick against the goads, the meaning of this proverb is that it's useless for a human to struggle and resist against the will of the gods. So, okay, if it means that to kick against the goads means you're resisting, you're being stubborn, you're not wanting to give in to the will of the gods, how had Paul been stubborn, struggling, and resisting against God? So for this, let's go back and recall the story of who Paul was before he became a Christian. By the way, let me just mention that in this passage, Jesus talks to Paul and calls him Saul, right? So it's usually a misconception that Saul was his name before the conversion and then he changed his name to Paul after he became a Christian. But that's not entirely correct. Saul is his Jewish name, used in Jewish-speaking context, while Paul is his name used in Greek-speaking context. So they're both his name, it's just depending on what language that we're referring to. So Paul was born to a Jewish family in the city of Tarsus. Tarsus was the capital of the province of Cilicia in Asia Minor, so modern-day Turkey. And Tarsus was one of the most important cities of that area. It was a cultural center that had schools of philosophy, schools of rhetoric, and from Paul's letters, from his writing style, from what he says, it seems like he was actually very well known and well versed in philosophy, in rhetoric, and even in Roman law. He knew that very well. So he had a very good Hellenistic education as well as his Jewish education. So his family, they had made sure that Paul received a good Jewish education as well. It seems like the family moved to Jerusalem when Paul was still a young boy. And it's that when they moved to Jerusalem is how he ended up studying under the Rabbi Gamaliel, who was one of the most distinguished rabbis of his time. Paul was a very gifted young student, and he even mentions that he was far ahead of the other boys his age in his zeal for Jewish law and traditions. When he's finished his studies with Gamaliel, usually this would be around 18 to 20 years of age, it seems like he went back to Tarsus to finish his secular education, and then returned to Jerusalem a few years later in order to pursue his rabbinic career in the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem and all that. So why do we say that he moved back to Tarsus and moved back to Jerusalem and all of that? Probably because we know from Paul's letters that he never met Jesus personally. So it's probably in that time span when he finished his studies in Jerusalem, went back to Tarsus, that Jesus' ministry was actually going on in Judea, Jerusalem, and all around. So by the time Jesus died, resurrected, went back to heaven, that is when Paul came back. So he barely missed Jesus in that time span when he was in Tarsus. So in the book of Acts, we meet Paul for the first time during the story of Stephen's stoning. While the mob is dragging Stephen out of the city, they were dropping their coats by Paul's feet as he stood to the side and watched everything that was going on. We know that Paul was a Pharisee, probably even a member of the Sanhedrin, which was that greatest body of Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. And it has been even suggested that him standing there while everybody leaves their coats at his feet actually shows that maybe he himself was actually in charge of the stoning. So seems like he was involved in everything that was happening to Stephen. And so the story of Stephen's death serves also as the introduction for the story of Paul. He's mentioned at the very end, and in the following chapter, we have the persecution that springs out against the Christians, and Paul is obviously involved in that persecution. So that's how we're introduced to Paul for the very first time. But actually, there may have been some interaction and even some debate between Paul and Stephen before Stephen's death. So turn with me to Acts chapter 6. Acts chapter 6, which is when Stephen is introduced. And I'd like to read verses 8 through 10. So Acts chapter 6, verses 8 through 10. And Stephen, full of grace and power, was doing great wonders and signs among the people. Then some of those who belonged to the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, and of the Cyrenians, and of the Alexandrians, and of those from Cilicia and Asia, rose up and disputed with Stephen. But they could not withstand the wisdom and the spirit with which he was speaking. So, in this passage, we read about Stephen going to a few synagogues and preaching and debating with the people who were there. So, at that time, first century Jerusalem, Judea, there were a lot of Jews living all over the Roman Empire, not only in Judea or Jerusalem. These Jews living all over the Roman Empire, they were known as Hellenistic Jews because they were culturally a little bit different from the Jews in Judea. They spoke Greek instead of Aramaic. And but a lot of them, at some point in their lives, eventually moved to Jerusalem. Obviously, Jerusalem was the center for their faith, religion, and all of that. Just like Paul's family, right? They were from Tarsus, but at some point they moved to Jerusalem in order for Paul to study and all those things. So that was pretty common. Jews from other places in the Roman Empire would move at some point to Jerusalem. So, just like today we have, Spanish church or Filipino church, African American churches, the same thing happens in Jerusalem. These people coming from different parts of the empire would gather together and have their own synagogue. That's what we see here. So we read about the synagogue of the freedmen. These were probably slaves who had been freed, and probably from Rome or from Italy or something like that, and now they're worshiping together in Jerusalem. We have the synagogue of the Cyrenians. This Cyrenians was the island of Crete. So people from the island of Crete gathered together to worship. The Alexandrians. The Alexandrians come from Egypt, the city of Alexandria in Egypt. This was also a very big city in the Roman Empire. And also, synagogue of those from Cilicia. Now, does Cilicia sound familiar? Paul was from Cilicia. The city of Tarsus, where he grew up and was born in, was in Cilicia. So, imagine now Stephen going to Paul's synagogue and getting up, preaching the gospel full of grace and power, and maybe Paul, one of the brightest and most educated members of that synagogue, maybe getting up and debating with Stephen, trying to argue and say, no, what you're talking about is not right, or something like that. So this is something that very well could have happened. It was his synagogue after all. But we read in verse 10 that they could not withstand the wisdom and the spirit with which he was speaking. Stephen was just too powerful, too full of the Spirit. And these very men, maybe even Paul himself, started the rumors and the accusations against Stephen, leading to his trial and death in the following chapter. So it seems like God had been working on Paul's conscience all the way back to the time of these debates with Stephen, showing him that even with all of his theological training, with all of his book learning, with everything that he knew, he was still not able to refute the gospel message. Imagine then the impression that Stephen would have caused on Paul when, as he was being stoned to death, Stephen still prayed for his persecutors. It really took a supernatural encounter, however, on the road to Damascus for Paul to finally allow God to transform his life and to make a difference for him. So yeah, we can definitely say that Paul was being stubborn, he was resisting, and something big had to happen for him to change. So now let's go back to Acts chapter 26, which is the chapter that we're looking at today. In Paul's speech before King Agrippa, remember that he was called to kind of defend himself, tell his story, tell what was going on, but he takes that opportunity to share his story, to share his conversion story. And in this speech, Paul emphasizes the purpose of God's call in his life. What was that purpose? To be a servant, to be a witness, to go to the Gentiles, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light. And that is exactly what Paul was doing in preaching before Agrippa. He was sharing the gospel message. He was sharing being a witness. And more than that, he was also appealing to Agrippa's own knowledge of scriptures and showing him how he had personally found those prophecies that were in the Bible to be true in his own life. Now this is significant because let's read here the end of chapter 26, when Paul is finishing up his speech, verses 26 through 29. Remember, he's talking to King Agrippa here. For the king knows about these things, and to him I speak boldly. For I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe. And Agrippa said to Paul, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? And Paul said, whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become as I am, except for these chains. So it's interesting that Paul shares his own story, how he had been resisting God, how he had been stubborn and just really closing his mind to the gospel message in front of this specific audience. He knew very well that Agrippa was aware of the scriptures. He knew that Agrippa knew the prophecies, that he was aware of everything that was going on. And Paul was very courageously and audaciously here telling Agrippa to stop resisting what he knew in his heart to be true. Which is why Paul can be so bold as to say, do you believe the prophecies? I know you believe the prophecies. I know you know it. Stop resisting. Don't be stubborn like I was. Look what happened to me. God transformed my life, and now he's giving you the opportunity to do the same. Stop resisting. Agrippa obviously understands exactly what Paul is trying to do, and he finds a very good way out, right? He doesn't agree with Paul, because if he did say, yes, you're right, he would be kind of caught in a trap having to accept the message. But at the same time, he isn't hostile towards Paul either, which shows us, so we know only a little bit about Agrippa's attitude towards the Christians from other sources, historical sources and everything. We know he did not become a Christian, But we also know that he did not actively persecute Christians either, which was significant. His father, for example, was very, very evil against the Christians. He was not. He was fine with the Christians. He left them alone. So who knows, perhaps Agrippa's encounter with Paul helped him have a little bit more of an open outlook towards the Christians. In any case, he did not hold Paul's effort to convert him against him, since at the end of the chapter, he does end up telling Festus that Paul is clearly innocent and could have been let go if he had not appealed to Caesar. So, how many times are we also stubborn? We also resist something that God has impressed upon our hearts. In Paul's case, it was obviously a big conviction that required a huge reorientation of his life. For us, it might be something less painful, something insignificant. We're already in February 2020. How many of us had a list of New Year's resolutions that we already gave up on because obviously we didn't follow through? Maybe we decided we wanted to eat healthier, go to the gym more often, spend more time in prayer. But I'm not talking necessarily about resolutions like that today, however good they may be. I'm referring to rather some small, quiet impressions that we feel tugging at our hearts sometimes. Things that we know are not good for us, that are not right, that are not honorable. Things that God has impressed upon our minds, but we've just been constantly ignoring, constantly shoving to the side, or even actively working against them. It might be something small. Maybe something is not right in your relationship, but you're too afraid of losing the person you're with to do anything about it. Maybe there's a lifestyle change that you should have done a long time ago, but you keep finding excuses. Or maybe you've been watching a TV show or something that you know you probably shouldn't be watching, but you just want to see what happens next. It might be something small, but for you it's a big deal, otherwise you wouldn't be stubborn and wouldn't be resisting it so much, right? So each one of us is going through something different in life. All of our journeys is different. But I know that we all go through moments like this, where deep down, you know God is trying to catch our attention. He's trying to tell us something, trying to tell us that something has to change. And I know change is difficult. It's easy to ignore impressions, to cover up our ears, go on with life as if nothing happened. But just like the oxen kicking against the goats, in the end, it's only going to hurt us even more. So what do we do if we feel that God is impressing something upon our hearts? I'd like you to turn with me to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2, verse 13. So Philippians 2, verse 13. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure, or good purpose, according to some other versions. So I'm going to use this passage to share what can we do if God is impressing something upon our hearts. First, ask yourself, what is keeping you from listening? Sometimes we resist out of sheer stubbornness. Sometimes we resist because we like our comfort zone. Sometimes we resist out of fear. In the beginning of the message, I mentioned that donkeys were stubborn, right? Well, actually, donkeys aren't just stubborn for the sake of being stubborn. As it turns out, they have a very good sense of self-preservation. If they feel they are in danger, they will plant their feet in the ground and they will refuse to move until they can assess the situation for themselves and decide whether or not it's safe to keep moving forward. In other words, what keeps them from moving forward is actually fear and not really stubbornness. Donkeys are known to be good problem solvers and less inclined to panic because of this, of their reaction to fear. And because of these characteristics, donkeys are trustworthy animals to walk on dangerous trails, for example, because if they see a snake on the ground, or if rocks are falling down the cliff, they will stop and think rather than just bolt and run. So, what is making you stop and resist? Ask yourself that. Try to identify what is making this so hard and give it up to God. Tell him about your fears, be open and honest with him, and just lay it all at his feet. Ask him to remove your fears. Ask him to give you the strength to get out of your comfort zone. Or just say, God, I know I'm being stubborn. Please help me. I need your help. Like Philippians 2:13 says that we just read, for it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. So the first thing is to ask God to give you the will to change, the will to stop resisting. Second, Philippians also says, God works in you to will and to act. If God is impressing you with something, he will also give you the strength to take that first step. So ask him for that strength. In Psalms 18, we read that God gives me strength for the battle. He makes my way perfect. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He helps me stand on the highest places. He trains my hands to fight every battle. My arms can bend a bow of bronze. Lord, you are like a shield that keeps me safe. You help me win the battle. Your strong hand keeps me going. You bend down to make me great. You give me a wide path to walk on so that I don't twist my ankles. So claim that promise. Have the assurance that just like the psalmist says, God will give you the strength that you need. And finally, number 3, remember that whatever God has planned for you is infinitely better than what you have planned for yourself. It is his good purpose. So trust that it is good. God's purpose for Paul was for him to be a witness, to take the gospel to the Gentiles. And when Paul first encountered the Christians in Jerusalem, in the beginning of the book of Acts, they were a small group of believers, mostly limited to the region of Judea. 20 years later, by the time we get here to Acts chapter 26, Christianity has already spread all throughout the Roman Empire. In large part because of Paul's own missionary work, because fulfilling God's purpose for his life. So just think about how good God's purpose for Paul's life was, not only for him, but for so many others as well. So if God has put something in your heart, it is because that is the best for you and for others in the long run. So trust him with it. There are 2 things that help donkeys not to freeze from fear when they come across a potentially dangerous situation. The first thing is confidence in the person who is leading him. The more he knows and trusts his owner, the more confidence he will have that he won't be led into danger. And the second thing that keeps them from freezing from fear is experience. As a donkey has more experiences, he begins to realize he doesn't need to be afraid of every little thing. He gains confidence, and he worries less about everything that is going on around him. It's the same with God. The more that we know and trust him, the more confidence we can have that whatever he has placed in our hearts is not only right, it is also the best thing for us. And the more we exercise that trust, the more experiences we have with God, the more we can see that God is transforming us and is leading us down a very good and right path for our lives. So I'd just like to encourage you today that whatever God is impressing in your life, whatever small thing it might be, it's the best for you. If God has put that in your heart, go to him in prayer. Ask him to help you with it and go through. If God puts it in your heart, it's because it's the best for you and for everyone else as well.